Unbelievable true stalker stories that will haunt you. It started with a dropped coin and a smile. I remember the exact sound, a small metallic clink against the linoleum counter at the bagel shop, then the soft scrape when I bent to pick it up. He was behind the counter, wiping a tray, and he reached out before I could finish. "You okay?" he asked, like it was nothing at all. He smiled the kind of smile that makes you go warm and polite in return. I thanked him and left, thinking nothing of it. It was a Monday routine. Coffee, everything bagel, a song in my headphones, a walk across town to rehearsal. That casual kindness is where it began. I didn't notice the first time he followed me off the street, or the second time I found him watching from a corner table. I told myself it was coincidence, people come and go. But the day he messaged me, the ordinary world tilted. At first it was small, one direct message on Instagram. "Hi." I kept it simple. A single blue dot, read and ignored. He didn't give up. The next message said, "Your laugh was stuck in my head today." And then, a few minutes later, "Where are you from?" He used a tone that was almost intimate, like we'd had conversations before when we hadn't. I blocked him. It felt like pressing a pause on that weird little weight in my chest, like closing a door. He found ways around it. New account after new account. One would pop up with a different handle, but the same photo angle, the same jaw and the same gap-toothed smile. He sent tiny comments on old posts, heart emojis under pictures from years prior. And when those were blocked, the notifications became more frantic. 27 new follower requests before dawn. A new account labeled with my hometown's initials. Likes stacked back to back, until my phone buzzed with a manic rhythm that made me look down even when I told myself not to. The theater was supposed to be my refuge. I was 20, stubborn and sleepless with rehearsals, chasing the thrill of a role and the compensatory exhaustion of performance nights. The backstage light was a different kind of quiet. We had patterns, Finn, the stage manager, tying up loose props with a cigarette between his fingers, the director last minute fixing a line, the same two baristas from the cafe who pretended not to notice when we arrived late. I trusted those walls. I trusted the wooden benches backstage and the rust of the old ladder that led to the catwalk. I trusted the small community of people who all smelled faintly of dust and hair products and the same shared adrenaline. And then I found handprints. It was after a late tech rehearsal, the kind that hums in your bones and keeps you awake for days. I remember the way the stage lights picked up every little particle in the air, making everything look perpetually on fire. We had finished, props were being returned, and I walked out to the parking lot gripping my script. My breath steamed in the cold. The car sat where I'd left it. At first it was just a dark smear on the window, a slight fog where a palm had rested. I thought maybe it was someone leaning to unlock their own car. Then I moved closer and saw the whirl of fingers, the precise pressure at the base of the palm. Someone had pressed their hand flat against my driver's side window, as if they had been right there looking at me. My stomach sank. I ran my fingers across the glass and felt the coolness, the dry streak where the residue should have been. I felt like a character in a nightmare who can't wake up. Finn saw the look on my face and followed me to the car. "What?" he asked, and I couldn't form the words at first. When I did, they were small and sharp. "There's a handprint." He didn't laugh. He didn't ask if I'd been drinking or if I'd left a light on. He held my gaze and then looked around, assessing. He asked if I wanted to call someone. I said no because I was embarrassed, and because I thought reporting it would make everything real in a way I wasn't ready to accept. Later, when I couldn't sleep, I imagined what that handprint meant. The space between my house and my rehearsal, the way my schedule was public on the theater's call sheet, the exact address where the cast pooled for late nights, all tiny signals in the world that had somehow become an arrow to me. 2 days later, flowers arrived. They showed up at my flat in the middle of the afternoon, a bouquet wrapped in brown paper and twine. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the packet lay on my doormat like a dare. It was rain damp, the scent of stems and earth escaping when I pried the paper open. Red roses, slightly bruised at the edges, and a small card tucked inside. 4 words, carefully written in thick black ink. The note read, "You would look beautiful with these in your bedroom." I read it 3 times. each time hearing a different meaning. The words were not threatening in the explicit sense. They were possessive in a way calmer language can never be. Someone had been inside my life enough to guess what would disturb me. It felt intrusive, like someone moving a piece of furniture in my home to make sure it would fit. The roses sat in water on my kitchen table until I couldn't stand their smell anymore. I took pictures because I had this odd compulsion to prove to myself that it had happened. The photo showed the bloom, the card, my hands around a vase. My phone buzzed with new notifications, a cluster of messages on Instagram that were, inexplicably, all to do with my last rehearsal night. "Your voice is mesmerizing," one said. "I could watch you work forever," another whispered. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. We spoke to the theatre staff. Finn arranged a meeting with the director and the house manager. I sat in the dim office, the smell of stale coffee and old programs filling the air, and watched grown people try to reconcile their trust in the community with the fact that someone had crossed a line. The house manager said the word ban slowly, like testing the flavor out. They would not allow him on theatre property anymore, he assured me. They would call the police if he tried to return. They would do what they could. The word police landed like cold water. I filed a report a few days later. I spoke to an officer who wrote down the URLs of profiles, the times of messages, the description of the man from the bagel shop, mid-20s, brown jacket, chipped tooth, the kind of details that, when repeated back by someone in uniform, felt simultaneously cleansing and impotent. They took the flowers as evidence, the card folded into an evidence bag, the roses that had once been vivid, now a pale, sad thing in plastic. I asked about restraining orders, and he said we could investigate. He said we would try. There was no promise with his voice, only process. At night the world changed shape. My phone became a metronome of anxiety. Every ping was an interrogation. I would wake at 2 a.m. from a dream where someone was standing at the foot of my bed, not moving, just watching me breathe. I learned to sleep with the lights dimmed, not because darkness was more restful, but because the glow from my street lamp looked less like someone standing close by. I started checking the back seat of my car before I sat down, a ridiculous ritual that settled some small part of my fear. I began to take the long way home, my route stretching on, adding time like armor. Blocking accounts became a daily chore. He created handles that seemed like jokes. Bagel.gizaishi, watch and wait, theater.ghost21. Each one squealed into my notifications with a fresh brand of persistence. The messages changed tone, as if becoming more practiced. Where once he had written flirty, artful lines, now the messages were breathy, urgent. I can't stop. I tried to leave them alone, tried to go on with my life, but the internet has a way of turning private into public without permission. Friends began to notice my phobia for my phone's vibrating. "Just put it away," they offered, casual and baffled. They couldn't see how the device carried a presence I couldn't escape. They didn't have to explain Instagram's algorithmic memory, how it cues people you interacted with to show up in recommendations, or how someone could make an account invisible to everyone but you and still flood you with contact. Theater nights were the worst. My eyes scanned the audience automatically, my gaze tracing faces for repetition, for a man who seemed familiar for the wrong reasons. I trained myself to look for posture, for the chipped tooth, for a jacket that could be mistaken for any other jacket. Sometimes I would see someone who fit the description, and my whole body would tense, my stomach falling as if I had just stepped off a curb into thin air. Finn became my lookout, without saying it. He'd make an offhand remark like, "We're clear in house 2, and the timing translated into relief. Once after a matinee, he intercepted a man lingering by the ticket counter. Finn asked, "Can I help you?" And the man stammered, gave a weird little laugh and left. Later, Finn told me he had recognized him from the bagel shop. A week after the flowers, there was a note slipped under my apartment door. Not a message this time, but a folded piece of paper with one line, "I'm always nearby." The handwriting was different, less practiced. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. I kept it in my pocket for hours, the corner rubbing into my thigh, the words pressed into my skin through cloth like an accusation. I didn't tell my parents because I hated the idea of the worry in their voices. I didn't want to be seen as someone who invited trouble by living alone and being young, but I told close friends, the ones who already knew about the messages and had an instinctual horror in their eyes. They came over and sat on my couch in a clumsy circle and offered to stay the night. They made tea. They tried to normalize the fear. It was kind, but normalizing didn't stop the small electric jolts when a late car door slammed outside or when the streetlight flickered and then steadied. We attempted a restraining order. I filed the paperwork with the help of an advocate who sat with me in a small office that smelled of lemon disinfectant and sympathy. They guided me through a system built for fairness and caution, a process that moved incrementally like a clock, not quickly enough for my panic. We laid out the messages, the accounts, the photographs of the handprint, the bag of evidence with the card. The form required details, descriptions, dates, narrative of harassment. Writing those days down made them heavier. The judge could grant an order that forbade contact. A violation of that order would escalate things. It felt like a promise, but with conditional clauses. No legal shield is impermeable, and I knew that instinctively. We left the courthouse with a paper in my hand that felt both like protection and like a label. To be marked as someone who needed a restraining order is to stand at the threshold of the ordinary and the extraordinary, and know that the crossing is irreversible. Even after the theatre banned him, after the police wrote in official ink and the restraining order forms were filed, the stalking didn't end exactly. It shifted. If you block a person online, they find new ways to exist in your periphery. He became a silhouette I could expect to see in my peripheral vision. I would catch a reflection in the shop window of someone who might be him, and my whole body would go still. I learned the small economies of anxiety, how many doors I could pass before someone would notice me, which times of day were busiest, which streets were dim enough that a figure could stand without being seen. The city itself grew rules I hadn't agreed to. It rearranged itself around his presence. People said the usual things. It will blow over. He'll get bored, and there are other people. But none of that attends to the way stalking changes the interior life. Sleep becomes thin. Dreams do not replenish. Food tastes flat. My hands grew small and nervous, always searching for my phone, checking the battery, the messages, whether an account had popped up that morning while I was still asleep. I tried to forget, and in trying I catalogued every small clue. Timings of messages, places I'd been that he explicitly referenced, the way certain posts led to new accounts the next day. I began to audit my life like someone auditing a crime scene, looking for points of leakage. A tagged photo, a mention of the theatre's address on our group page. There were tiny digital breadcrumbs that suddenly mattered. A selfie with a street sign in the background. A rehearsal schedule posted publicly by an assistant. Each one felt like handing a stranger a set of coordinates to where I spent my nights. The emotional residue is what stays. Fear stains things subtly. Months later, after the ban and the filed documents, I'd be on a walk and notice a man leaning against a lamppost, and my heart would leap and my breath would snag. The world has a geometry of safety when you're alone. Stalking redraws those lines. I found myself thinking in exiles. Safe routes, public routes, routes with cameras. There were moments of ridiculousness too. I started keeping an extra pair of keys tucked in a different pocket, because the idea of having been watched while I unlocked my door felt obscene. It is humbling to find that the body remembers threats long after the rational mind has filed them away as unlikely. When friends asked how I was, I would pause because some things are too complicated for the small radio of casual conversation. It is easier to say I'm fine than to outline the protocol of my nights. There is stigma wrapped in being a target. People are scared for you and embarrassed for themselves. Our collective language for these situations is hobbled. We are better at saying lock your doors than we are at acknowledging how one's interior life is rearranged by the knowledge of being watched. A year after the first messages, I still flinched when someone cleared their throat behind me. I married the habit of cautious curiosity. I learned to listen for the small things that signal repetition. That is why Finn's attentiveness stayed with me, not because he was heroic in a cinematic sense, but because someone else noticed. Someone else looked, and that made a difference. He would say offhand and without drama, "If anyone bothers you again, tell me. Don't think about what people will say." He made the theatre feel like a place with a nervous, imperfect sort of safety. When a stranger is watching, the world narrows to the people who care enough to act. After the police report, the theatre ban, the paperwork, and a handful of careful nights, I thought the worst of it had passed. I naively convinced myself that if I carried on with my life cautiously enough, the irregularity would wear off. He had been forced to the perimeter for now. The messages dwindled in intensity and frequency. New accounts still appeared, one every so often like a stubborn weed, but they were easier to manage, block, report, breathe. I began to breathe more easily, like water seeping back into a dry well. Then, 3 months after the flowers, I opened my mail to find a photograph tucked between bills and a jury summons. It was a photo of my car, shot from an angle that could only have been taken from the footpath near my flat. The image caught my bumper, the street number in clear view, and a section of my window with a faint smudge someone had photographed as evidence of my leaving the car unlocked. A lie designed to provoke a reaction. On the back of the photograph someone had written, in the same heavy-handed script as the note with the roses, "Saw you there." The handwriting looped in a way that felt intimate, like someone drawing a line to underline their claim. I called Finn from my kitchen and handed the photo to him through the phone. He heard the tremor in my voice and drove over within 20 minutes. He sat across my kitchen table with the cheap ceramic mug of tea I'd reheated and said very plainly, "We're not letting this be normal." He made phone calls, logged the image with the police, and called the theatre's staff meeting into a huddle. They took it seriously because he made them. Others who saw the photograph would later say it was the quality of his anger, the way he refused to accept the idea that this was just the price of being young and living your life. There was no grand gesture, no cinematic takedown, just phone calls and reports and the slow bureaucratic work of naming a person where one had been nameless. A restraining order was sought. The theatre banned him. The police said they would follow leads. I felt a mix of relief and an almost childlike suspicion. The relief that someone was trying to do what systems offered, and the suspicion that these protections were porous, like a net with holes large enough for a determined person to wiggle through. We learned that stalking doesn't end simply because someone gets banned from a building or blocked online. It moves and mutates. It learns new channels. The nights kept me awake for reasons that had nothing to do with immediate threat and everything to do with the new way I experienced the world. Places that had once been neutral took on new meaning. The bagel shop's location became a waypoint to consider, the theatre parking lot a place to scan. I replayed interactions, the feel of a hand on a countertop, a smile that had been ordinary. Their simple courtesy became a key to a long chain of events that taught me how much of my life I had unconsciously given away, in tagged photos, in casual check-ins, in posts meant for friends that were public by default. I still go to the bagel shop sometimes. The smell of sesame and poppy seeds is a small comfort, a slice of normal. When I go, I sit by a table near the window. I watch the door like someone always expects the scene to repeat, and I'm aware that that expectation shapes reality. I am not the same person who dropped that coin and accepted a stranger's help. I carry now an attentiveness sharpened by fear. It is tiring. It is expensive in mental energy. But it is also a fierce kind of self-presence I didn't possess before. If this sounds like a slow, almost inevitable slide from gentle attention into violation, that is because it is. The web of it is small threads, a compliment, a follow, a comment. It sounds mundane until it doesn't, until the handprints appear, until the roses arrive, until a photo shows up on your mat in the mail. If this story is speaking to you in any way, please stay with me for what comes next. If you want to hear the next account, one that begins on a quiet street at night and ends with a terrifying wake-up call, subscribe and turn on notifications. Share this with someone who needs to understand how ordinary moments can become dangerous. We need to be able to tell each other what we see without shame. What the bagel shop taught me was not merely that people can be persistent. It taught me how quickly information we consider private becomes visible, how small details can be the difference between a stranger's curiosity and a campaign of attention that refuses to stop. It taught me to pay attention to how public my life had been, without blaming myself for being young and visible. Most of all, it taught me that the people around you, the stage manager who noticed, the house manager who acted, the friends who stayed, can pull the pieces together when you cannot. They are imperfect shields, but shields nonetheless. And even with those shields, the fear does not evaporate. It lodges in the small things. A tap on a glass at the theater will make my hands freeze. A new account will make my chest clamp for a second. I have learned to move forward anyway. The next story is different, but not unrelated. It begins with a late-night drive, a flicker of headlights and a figure standing beyond the pharmacy window. The presence there is quieter, more patient in some ways, and it shows me how stalking can live in silence as well as intrusion. I hadn't known that one moment. A glance from across the street could ripple into 12 hours of sleeplessness, and a sound I would never forget. I should have known perhaps that watching is a skill refined by repetition. He had watched me pick up a coin. Later, someone else would watch me drive past at night. The pattern repeats. The difference is in proximity and escalation. The next time the story picks up, it's a late winter night and the streetlights are tired. The pharmacy's sliding doors hiss open like a throat, and the world smells faintly of disinfectant and petrol. I can still feel the cold when I drag my memory there. The way my breath steamed, the way the car's heater coughed before warming, the insignificant shuffle of feet on the pavement. But I am not ready yet to describe that night. Not here, not now. There is a certain sharpness to the moment that deserves its own space. For now, what lives with me is the knowledge that a smile and a dropped coin were the first notes in a song that changed my life. The melody is still familiar, and sometimes in a quiet hour I hear it and flinch. It was late winter, and the streetlights had that exhausted sodium glow that makes everything look a little blurred at the edges. I was driving home from a friend's place around 2 in the morning. There are always those drives when the whole city feels empty and somehow private. The pharmacy on the corner had its fluorescent face on, the sliding doors gleaming, an indifferent beacon against the dark. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the street looked like a place you could make a new life. Anonymous, soft-edged, easy to disappear into. As I slowed at the intersection, my headlights caught someone standing across the pavement. He was just a shape at first. Dark coat, head slightly bowed, hands shoved into his pockets. It was the sort of silhouette you see and dismiss, until you realize the person is looking straight at you, and then the dismissal stops being easy. He didn't move as I passed. He didn't hurry out of the way or glance away. He stood and watched me drive by, and the way he watched made something begin to pull tight in my chest. I parked 2 streets over and sat with the engine idling, telling myself I was being irrational. Maybe he was waiting for the bus, maybe he was lost in his phone. The rational list went on because the irrational one, someone watching you, felt stupidly vulnerable. I told myself to breathe and drove home. For the rest of the night I turned the lights on in every room before I sat down, as if illumination were deterrent. Sleep was fragmentary. Every time a car rolled past my window, my heart jumped. I told a friend about the man outside the pharmacy and she said, "Probably nothing. People stand outside shops at night." The words were meant to soothe, but they smoothed only one thin layer over something far messier. The next evening I walked to the corner store for milk. The pharmacy was closed. Its doors reflected the empty sidewalk. There was a dark shape under the streetlight, the same posture, the same slow, patient stillness. I crossed the street and passed by at a polite distance. He didn't flinch, he didn't look surprised. He watched the pattern of my walk like someone following a script. That night, at 3:30 in the morning, I woke to the faint sound of humming. It was quiet at first. There was the hum of the refrigerator, the distant thump of a neighbor's TV, and then a single tune, soft and tuneless, rising from somewhere near my bedroom window. It was a child's lullaby or a fragment of one. It had no words, just a round, rolling quality that made my skin crawl. I sat up and listened. The humming grew closer in a way that felt impossible if the source were outside. It sounded as if someone had crossed the thin boundary the air makes at my closed window. Then there was the slight sound of leather against glass. My blinds were shut, but they weren't heavy. A shadow moved where they were, and then, for a moment, a pale oval pressed against the covering, as if a face were right there at the other side. I could see the indent where a glove-covered hand flattened the fabric. The fingers were long and deliberate, like someone tracing the outline of a face they wanted to claim. I remember the precise taste of copper in my mouth, the surge of adrenaline that makes your tongue dry and sharp. I dialed 9999 with fingers that felt clumsy and foreign. My voice when the operator answered was small and steady, because the smallest voice sounds formal in the face of emergency. "There's someone outside my bedroom window," I said. "They're humming. They have gloves on." I moved quiet as possible, the weight of the house and the sound of my own breath becoming things I had to measure. The hum stopped when the operator asked more questions. I could hear a faint shuffling, as if the person outside had realized they were discovered and had retreated a step. The operator stayed on the line asking for the address, promising the word "officer" like an icicle of certainty I did not yet feel. By the time the police arrived, the taste in my mouth had dissolved into nausea. The officers were calm and efficient in a way that made me both grateful and hollow. They checked the perimeter, knocked around the back, peered through hedges. They found marks near the bedroom window, indentations in the damp soil from the boots someone had worn, and a smear on the window frame where a gloved hand had caught at the sill. On the pavement close to my door, they found fragments of glass and a length of black rubber they bagged for evidence. They called it in as a break-in attempt, though no door had been forced. Someone had smashed a small section of the pharmacy's front glass that night, shards littering the pavement like glitter. When the officers walked me over, the shop's front looked wounded, an opening patched with a blue sheet and police tape. The supermarket lights made the broken edges glitter, and the smell of antiseptic and broken glass clawed at the back of my throat. They said the smash was likely the source of the shadow I had seen, that someone could have slipped through the broken glass or used the disruption as cover to move along the row of buildings unnoticed. They took my statement, photographed the marks at my window and the disturbed soil, and told me to keep my doors locked and to call back if anything happened again. There was a lot of "if" in what they said, which left a ring of anxiety hollowing my confidence out. The officers were kind but matter-of-fact. "We'll run CCTV for the area," one said. "We'll follow up shots of nearby license plates. Keep us updated." These were good steps. They are the things a system offers. They are also not promises. Afterwards, the house felt reconfigured. The place where I'd once hung clothes to dry became a flimsy fortress. I started arranging furniture so that my bed was the least exposed to any window. I checked every lock 3 times each night and taught myself to listen for soft sounds. The click of a gate, the whisper of footsteps over gravel, the faint scrape that could be a glove or a deliberate attempt to set you on edge. The humming lodged under my skin. For weeks, whenever I heard a tune or passed a shop with broken glass taped over its windows, my stomach dropped, as if someone had kicked me. Months later, friends suggested moving, as though the act of relocation could sever the thread of being watched. I thought about it more than once, the logistics turning like a little internal calculator, work, rent, the tyranny of notice periods, but I didn't have the means or the certainty to take that step right away. Instead, I learned to live with the spot on my street that had been the scene of smashed glass, with the knowledge that somewhere in the perimeter a person had chosen to watch and had the patience to wait until night offered cover. I would drive past the pharmacy now with my hands at a slightly different angle on the wheel, my eyes notched for movement. Sometimes I slowed just a little, my heartbeat picking up like a drum, and I would look at the boarded patch as if my gaze would scorch the memory into nothing. Everything familiar became an archive of small fears. A knocked bin was a possible hiding place. A shadowed alley could hold someone patient. It is remarkable how little cover you need to be frightened. You do not need someone to reach for you. You only need to know someone has reached for you at the edges of your life. The second story taught me that stalking often moves in silence. The quiet watch. The patient presence outside a small commercial window. It wasn't always about messages or bouquets. Sometimes the message is proximity, the claim of a person simply being there in the architecture of your nights. That kind of invasion is quieter, but no less invasive. It left me with a lingering sense of vulnerability that made even daylight scheduling complicated. I sought the bright hours more urgently than I had before. Not all stalking leaves obvious clues immediately. Sometimes it starts with noises in the walls, or ornaments moved a fraction of an inch. Sometimes the evidence is muddier. The faint footprint of a shoe in a carpet, a water jug left where you did not put it. The third story I want to tell you begins with those small, almost pathetic signs that something is wrong, and ends with a cold revelation that a supposed routine worker might have had the means to enter without breaking a window at all. I moved into my first proper apartment when I was 20. It felt like a rite of passage. The rent, the key with the little plastic tag, the nervous joy of arranging my things the way I wanted. At first there were only ordinary mishaps, the kettle left on, a window unlocked in a moment of forgetfulness, but then I noticed things that didn't add up. It began with muddy footprints on the mat inside the hallway, small boot-shaped impressions leading in from the front door and toward the kitchen. At first I thought I must have tracked them in myself after a late shift, but I kept my own shoes by the door, and there were no matching prints. They were neat, like someone who took the time to wipe their feet, but not enough to clean them entirely. There was no other sign of forced entry. The lock was intact, the chain still latched in the evening. The footprints were patient evidence, like a finger drawn over a fogged window saying, "Look." Then there were the little rearrangements. A bottle of water that was usually on the counter found on the top of the fridge. The heating thermostat nudged a degree lower than I'd set it. A small ceramic dish for my keys turned over on the table, for no reason I could explain. None of it felt like theft. Nothing of value had been taken, just presence, the proof that someone else had been in my rooms and had left a signature that made my skin crawl. I taped a long strip of clear packing tape across my bedroom doorframe on a whim one night, a childishly inadequate plan, and when I came back in the morning the tape was askew and there were tiny snags in the edges. It was the first real confirmation that someone had been inside without my permission. The tape test made the unthinkable thinkable. I pressed my ear against the door and listened to the house breathe, as if expecting reproductions of sounds to return to me as evidence. The police came when I found certain small items moved, and a window left slightly ajar that I knew I'd closed. They took photographs, wrote their notes, and told me there had been reports in the area of petty thefts and suspicious persons. They suggested I keep a log. Their tone was helpful and soft in the way of people trying to be useful in a world that is complex. The landlord, when I reported the unauthorized entries, was less helpful. He called it weird and told me to be careful, matter of fact, without the tenderness I wanted. He also mentioned how he did repeated checks of the building, but that nothing seemed wrong. His comforting words worked only as far as the surface. Curiosity, I learned, can be a form of indifference if it doesn't move into action. The intrusions continued. I started leaving a little pile of flour on the kitchen counter at night, as another primitive test. No one ever expects flour, and footprints transfer beautifully into it. In the morning, there would be a subtle ridge, a trail where someone had walked across. It felt like a childish game being used to catch an adult trespasser, and yet that childishness was my only tool. I kept the proofs in photos, an imprint here, a slightly soaked curling of paper towel there, the smear of boot tread on the welcome mat. The evidence was small but accumulating. Then, more seriously, I came back one afternoon to find my laptop missing. At first I convinced myself I'd packed it away for a trip or left it at a friend's, but the office insisted I hadn't. I tore my place apart in a panic. Desk drawers open, jewelry boxes emptied and checked, the bed stripped to see if anything had slipped under it. There was a pattern. Nothing else of small value was gone. No jewelry, no cash, only the electronics that someone could easily fence. The police were called. They wrote a new statement this time. What made me feel violated in a new way was not just the theft, but the possibility that the person who had taken it had done so knowing the rhythms of my life. When I left, when my neighbors were away, which doors were bolted last? The landlord, finally pressed by the police reports and my growing argument, told me something offhand that I didn't want to hear. He mentioned a maintenance worker who had had keys to many apartments and who had been let go months earlier for unrelated grievances. The worker's name was not given in full to me then, only implied in a way that made my stomach drop. Later, months after I'd moved out, a former colleague of mine who worked in building services told me a story about a man arrested for entering women's apartments. It wasn't a neat closure. She didn't say this man was certainly the one who had entered mine, but the possibility settled heavy and cooling across the events. The idea that someone with keys, who moved in and out of the building as part of their job, could have used that access to violate tenants' privacy felt worse than the notion of a burglar smashing a lock. There was a betrayal of trust innately woven into roles that allow people into private spaces. After the theft, I did the things you're supposed to do: change passwords, wipe accounts, file police statements, and move out as soon as it was feasible. I found a new place 2 neighborhoods away, something brighter and with a heavier lock. Moving felt like both admission and survival. When you pack up your life because you cannot trust the one next door anymore, the boxes begin to look like armor. I told friends and family in small measured doses. The language of explaining trauma feels always inadequate, too thin to convey the sensation that another person had been threading themselves through your days. Years later, in conversation with someone from the building where I'd once lived, I learned that the maintenance worker had, in fact, been arrested for breaking into multiple apartments. The account was reported in hushed phrases. He'd been using his master keys. It wasn't a movie-style reveal. There was no dramatic courthouse scene handed to me on a silver platter. It was a single piece of information, a kind of loose punctuation on a sentence that had run long and tangled. The idea that the man who had probably entered my apartment was removed from circulation offered a measure of relief, sharp, sudden, and then complicated by the knowledge that justice is messy and incomplete. The aftermath of this kind of violation is odd. Relief and rage can happen side by side. I felt a guilty easing when I learned of the arrest. Guilt because my relief felt disproportionate compared to the years some other people might still live in fear, and also an exhausted wariness. Even though the likely suspect had been taken away, the patterns he'd revealed remained. Small intrusions that could be missed, doors left unlatched by those with keys, the casual way workers move through buildings with the authority their roles give them. I began asking more questions about who had access to properties I lived in. I found it harder to let maintenance people into my place without scrutinizing ID, a tremor of suspicion shaping how I answered the door. Meeting my partner later, years after I left that building, helped me heal in practical ways. It wasn't a cure. Relationships don't eradicate trauma, but having someone who knows where you sleep and who listens to the old small fears without minimizing them, the person who would, for example, sit with you in a brightly lit room until you stopped imagining shadows, matters. Love did not dissolve the residual hypervigilance, but it offered a different landscape in which to practice trust again. Trust became not a cliff to step from, but a slow shore to inch toward, hands in someone else's steady palms. Across these stories, at the bagel shop, by the pharmacy window, and in my old apartment, the common thing isn't always the method. It's the steady erosion of feeling safe. Magnified attention is a slow, consuming thing. It finds the small opt-ins we offer the world, location tags, rehearsal schedules, unlocked doors, and turns them into a map. What we discover is not that we did something wrong in being visible. It's that the world has channels we never considered could be used against us. I am left with a handful of images that replay without consent. The handprint on my car window under the theater lights, the gloved fingers pressing the bedroom blind, the flower tracing a path across my counter. Each image arrives in my mind as if on cue when the city gets quiet. And in that stillness, I have to reassure myself that the images are memories, not ongoing presences. Still, when I go to bed now, I habitually double-check locks and confirm the chain on the door. It is not heroic, it is pragmatic. It is also a quiet cost to live with, this permanent low-level readiness that refracts itself through every new city, every new flat, every unfamiliar person whose look lingers. If there is anything these experiences have taught me, it is to listen to the small things that feel wrong. I wish I could tell you that every time we raise an alarm, the system will fix it, and that the person who watches or who quietly enters will be stopped. The truth is messier. Sometimes response is swift and decisive. Sometimes it is slow and under-resourced. Sometimes it results in charges. Other times only in paper reports. The hard work is often not in dramatic interventions, but in the day-to-day practices of being watched, and then reclaiming a life that feels whole again. To anyone watching who recognizes a part of themselves in these stories, I want to say this plainly: your feelings are valid. Not everyone will understand the specific circuitry of fear that comes from being watched or followed. Not everyone will say the right thing, but that does not mean your fear is unjustified. Talk to someone you trust. Document the strange incidents, dates, times, photos, because small things accumulate into evidence. Reach out to local support services if you can. People who work with survivors understand in ways friends sometimes do not. I know that is a softer, more cautious closing than the one some of these tales deserve. There is anger here too. Anger over assumptions, anger at the social spaces that enable anonymity to be weaponized, anger at systems that sometimes move slowly. But there is also, threaded through the anger and fear, a deep gratitude for the people who noticed and acted. The stage manager who didn't laugh, the police officer who took a statement late at night, the friend who sat on the couch and held a mug of warm tea while I explained why I couldn't sleep. Those small acts of attention are the ones that pull us back. These stories will haunt me in small ways for years. They will show up in the way I arrange my bag, the routes I choose to walk, the cautious tilt of my head when someone smiles. But being haunted is not the same as being alone. There are people who will see, who will listen, who will take the small but consequential steps that make life livable again. If these accounts have reached you, if even one detail feels familiar, please check the description for helplines and resources that might help. Share thoughtfully. These stories are painful for the people who lived them, and we owe them dignity in how we pass them on. If this hit home, if you feel a knot of recognition or concern, please consider sharing this video respectfully and checking the description for links to support organizations and hotlines. And if you haven't already, subscribe to hear more stories with care and context. Above all, look out for the small things. They tell the truth more often than we expect.